Hello and welcome to the Learning Hub's video on MLA versus APA style. In this video we'll be talking about the two most common citation styles used at college and sort of break them down to understand the differences between the two and examples of how you can model them in your coursework. So first of all, what are we talking about? MLA and APA are the two most common citation styles used in higher education, at least at UIS. So to break down the difference, MLA is a style from the Modern Language Association, and typically we see it used in first-year courses, English courses, and then select other courses according to instructor preference. APA style is from the American Psychological Association and typically is used in upper-level social science disciplines, but it's also probably the most common citation style used at UIS once you get out of your first-year courses. Now, as you can see, the MLA is on its 9th edition currently, and the APA is on its 7th edition. Both of these are relatively new, but new editions do come out periodically to update citation styles, writing styles, and other things that come along with these guides to ensure that we are up to date with the current trends in the world. Now, when we talk about MLA versus APA, there are four things we're going to cover in this workshop. The first are the priorities that differentiate the two systems, and then we'll get into the actual ways that these styles require you to format your papers and then use research in your papers. So that includes the formatting and then the in-text and end citations. Before we get into any of this, though, I think it is important to recognize the elephant in the room, so to speak, which is the question about why should I even learn how to cite? Shouldn't I just use a citation generator? And in the Learning Hub and many other places in higher education, we have some trouble with citation generators. More often than not, in fact, I don't think I've ever seen a citation come out of one of those generators fully correct, but more often than not, they will be either not up to date, so these styles change editions fairly frequently, as I said. If they're automatic, they might grab incorrect information or might miss out on information, and they might not have the correct or consistent punctuation or formatting for the citations that they crank out. And in fact, learning to do the work yourself is going to be a good habit for you to get into. It leaves less room for error because you are checking over your own work. It's promoting good practice in your discipline, taking control of the research you're using, and it's going to help you make more informed choices about the research that you've found and are using in your writing. In particular, we like to point out that MLA is context driven, which means that it has a formula and different citations fit that formula in different ways. And so a machine might not be able to make the same choices you can about the types of sources that you integrate into your projects. So as an example, this comes from our APA materials. We have here this citation that we plugged into BibMe. Well, this is an MLA example actually, pardon me. And this is anyway, the citation we plugged into BibMe, and you can see everything in red is incorrect. So you can see here what it actually should look like. It completely got wrong the name of the website. It didn't include the publisher title. It's missing the date, got completely wrong for some reason, and even the URL wasn't listed properly. And with this type of citation, we don't actually need an access date. So the whole second half of the citation, it got pretty much entirely wrong. Here's our APA example. So as you can see, again, everything in red is incorrect. The capitalization rules, which we'll cover in a little bit, in an APA reference list citation is covered quite differently. It was entirely missing the location NPR, and you no longer need the retrieved from information or label prior to your URL. So this one's not nearly as egregiously wrong, but it is still incorrect according to APA style guidelines. And so hopefully you can see that the amount of work you have to do to fix these citations on the back end after plugging them into whichever citation generator you use is just as much work as if you were to build them yourself correctly from your launching point. So we do recommend learning these citation styles, and doing this work yourself gives you more command over your writing and more confidence over the sources that you're using. We also like to point out where you can find different citation style resources. The Learning Hub has handouts on our website specific to different writing situations and topics. We have an entire section dedicated to citation and another section dedicated to research methods to help you learn how to use sources and then attribute which sources you're using in your writing effectively. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Purdue OWL, which is considered pretty much the industry standard best place to go for information and help with citation. So this site here is very useful for both MLA and APA. And then even our UIS library has an intro to research guide, which is very helpful for getting started in the research process. And as part of these materials, they also provide some citation help as well. If I was doing this workshop with a group of folks, I would ask the room, where else do you look when you're looking up citation information? Because I have no captive audience with me today, I will instead tell you one other place I think is useful, and that's just to Google things. If you're running into a citation question and you think, I don't know where to find this, you can just Google how to cite an edition of a book in MLA or how to cite a classroom handout in APA, and you can find plenty of sites that give you those resources and examples and good information. Now you want to be choosy on which source you use for those types of citing questions. Usually you can find .edu sites that are other learning centers out there in the world that provide this information for their students, but publicly on their website so that you also have access. So do make sure you pick and choose which sites you use for these Googled questions, but that can be another really great tool for specific things that you run into. Now, our first major category of difference is priorities. This is pretty straightforward and pretty easy, but we do like to point it out because the reason for MLA style is very different from the reason for APA style. And as I mentioned before, it's not just the citation of sources. MLA and APA are primarily a writing style guide. So it's not just the citation, it's also the style of writing, the reasons for writing, and in these two contexts, they're going to be very different. So MLA is primarily focused on authorship, who is putting these ideas out there, and then the quality and content of the ideas themselves. MLA is used primarily in an English discipline and humanities disciplines, and so we care very much about who is writing and what they're writing about. Ideas. APA is going to prioritize the information and its relevance and accuracy. So currency is very important to APA. Currency meaning how recent the information was published. This is why you'll see the date placed very prominently in citations and in-text citations in this style compared to MLA, where dates are sort of offset to the back end of a citation. APA also cares very much about diminishing bias with the information that you often cite in these types of styles. It's very sciences based, it's data heavy, and so we want to make sure that we don't have bias when we're looking at this data because we see a person's full name that indicates to us that's a woman, that's a person from a particular culture, or whatever other information we can glean from a name. So that's why you'll see in APA citations, authors' names are transitioned into initial format. So instead of Sarah Collins, it would be S. Collins. It's for diminishing bias purposes. Overall, we see a prioritization, of data over authorship. So whereas in MLA, we care very much about ideas and who's putting those ideas out there, in APA, we care about the data, the hard data, and what that data has to tell us about whatever topic we're working with. Not so much the authorship themselves, instead it's the currency of that data, the date when that data came about. The second primary category of difference is formatting, so we'll give you some examples here. Now there are some things that are shared between MLA and APA. Both citation styles ask for 1-inch margins, double spacing, Times New Roman, 12-point font, or another readable font like Calibri 11-point, or such similar fonts and sizes, and first line indents for paragraphs, where the first line of a paragraph is indented inward 1/2 inch. These are all common between these citation styles. Another thing that's common between the citation styles is instructor preference is going to be prioritized over any of these rules. So for example, if you have an instructor who calls for single spacing for their projects that you submit for their classes, you should single space. MLA and APA both say that whatever the instructor says goes, but otherwise these are the default guidelines. Otherwise, these are some of the primary differences between the two styles. So in APA, they do call for a title page, whereas in MLA there is no title page associated with that type of document. In the top left of the first page of an MLA paper, you put certain information that includes the name, which is your name, the instructor's name, we'll show you an example of what that can look like, the class, and the date. Remember, this is just a little, we'll put a pin in this for later, dates in MLA have very specific formatting requirements. You also have header information, so the header is the top strip of the paper. In an MLA paper, you put your last name and the page number, no punctuation, just a space between the last letter of your name, last name, and then the number. And then you also have a title underneath the top left information, but you don't bold it or give it any other designation other than putting it in title case, which is capitalization rules. And then you jump immediately into your text. I'll show you an example of an MLA page so you can see what I'm talking about. In APA, after the title page for the first page of your paper, you also have header information. This is just the page number though, so no last name, no nothing, just the digit for whichever page we're on. That does start on the title page and works its way down. At the top of the page, starting the beginning of your paper, you include the title. This is bolded, so whereas in MLA you don't use bold, in APA you do. And then on the very next line down, you start the text of your paper. APA also has very strict rules for any headings that you include to further break up your paper. So if you want to section it off into, say, methods, and then within methods you want to talk about participants and data collection, those would be level 1 and then level 2 headings respectively. And so APA has very specific formatting it calls for with those style of headings. MLA does not have any designated formatting for headings. You can use them, they're not as common, but if you do use them, they say pick a style that works for you and make sure you're consistent with it. They don't have strict guidelines for those headings. So here's an MLA paper. This is the very first page. The top of the page would be right underneath the title of the slide. So you can see in the header it's a little bit grayed out. We have the last name and page number. No punctuation, just a space between. At the very top of the body of the page, we have the full name for the student, the full name for the instructor with any honorifics. You could put professor, you could put doctor, whatever is appropriate for your instructor's name. You could also do just last name here as well if you'd like. Then you have class, and that's the call number for the class. So ENS 401 here, ENG 101 or 102 in other cases, whatever the call number for the course is. And then here you can see the date information that I told you is very specific. So in MLA, dates are always formatted the numerical digit for the day, space, the full spelled out name of the month or the abbreviation for the month. So we have August here. You could also do AUG period, space, and then the year in all 4 digits. So 2 August 2017 here. On the very next line down, we have the title of the paper, and you can see it's not in bold or anything. It's just plain text other than the capitalization rules for what's called title case. You can Google title case and you can see more rules about that. And then on the very next line down, no extra spaces between any of this information. It's just one line after the other. We start the actual body of the paper with a first line indent. You can see that indentation here. An APA title page looks like this. The APA 7th edition has now designated student formatting guidelines so that students don't have to format their papers the same way that someone hoping to publish their paper in a journal would, and it allows you to include other information like the class and your instructor and the due date. But it would look like this. So in the header, again, a little grayed out, you can see just the page number right aligned on the page. About 3 or 4 lines down, double spaced. So you click into the top of the page, make sure you're double spaced and hit enter 3 or 4 times. You then place the title of your paper. This goes in bold. You then hit enter twice, so there is an extra space between the title and then your name here. You don't have to put your middle initial if you don't want to, but your full name, first, last name. One line down, you put the department and then the institution. So this would be the department of the class that you're in. So that could be Department of English, Department of Biology, Department of Psychology here, comma, University of Illinois Springfield, or whichever college or university you're at. Next line down from that, we have the course. And for this information, you put the call number and then the full name of the course with a colon between. So that in this case, we have Sci 311, colon, adolescent brain development. Next line down, the name of your instructor. So again, place any honorifics appropriately before their name. So Dr. John Doe here. And then the very next line, you have the date. This is typically going to be the due date for the assignment, but you would have the month first, then the day, comma, and then the year. This is probably a little more typical for what you think of when you think of putting a date somewhere, versus MLA is perhaps a little weirder for us American writers. So hopefully this makes sense, but this is what the title page of an APA paper looks like. The rest of the page underneath all of this is just blank. So then the page after that is the first page of the actual body of your paper. And here you can see the header continues with page 2 up here in the top, but then you include the title of your paper again in bold, top center aligned of the page, and on the very next line down, you start your paper and you indent it over half an inch. This looks like a little extra bit of an indent here. That's a whoops. But you indent it over, same as you do in an MLA paper, you just have this extra title here at the top that you've repeated from the title page. Other things about formatting, including the use of source material that are worth talking about. In general, when you are using quotations, or using source material rather, excuse me, you have 3 ways to provide that information. You can directly quote, you can paraphrase, or you can summarize. This information is covered in another workshop of ours on using quotations and also in avoiding plagiarism, so check those out if you're not sure on those definitions. But broadly speaking, MLA as a citation style is going to prefer the use of quotes, generally speaking, but paraphrases are also acceptable, and obviously summaries kind of follow along with paraphrases. It's just because we care very deeply about authorship and ideas, seeing the author's actual wording for information is valuable, so that's why quotes are generally preferred. In APA, they generally prefer paraphrases because the way the author said it isn't necessarily as important as the content of that information, the data or the statistic or whatever it is. And so embedding it and integrating it with your own writing is going to be preferable than having it stick out like a sore thumb as a direct quote. So quotes are generally acceptable sparingly in most cases in APA. Sometimes you will run into an instructor who says, I do not want to see any quotations whatsoever in your paper, only paraphrase or summarize. But in APA default format, you are allowed to quote, but paraphrasing is generally the preferred method. Now, both citation styles have guidelines for how long a quote can be before you need to make changes to the formatting. So generally speaking, there are what are called short quotes and long, or also called block quotes. We have handouts and materials on how to format block quotes, so do check that out. But just generally speaking, in MLA, they designate lines of text. So however many lines of text your quote takes up is where you designate. So if it's under 4 lines of text, it's a short quote, and if it's over 4 lines of text, it's a block quote. In APA, they're a lot more specific, which I appreciate. If it is less than 40 words of text, so 39 words or shorter, you can format it as a short quote. But if it is 40 words or longer, you format it as a block quote. So what that looks like generally, so again, MLA, less than 4 lines, APA, fewer than 40 words for a short quotation. Here you can see generally what that looks like. So in the first one, we have an example of where everything would go in the end parentheses. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but you can see the quote is integrated in with the sentence, and it isn't given any special formatting, it just is part of the sentence. In the second example, we have broken out the citation to include parts in different places for context. Again, we will cover this a little bit later, but again, you can see the quote is just part of the sentence. For long quotations, again in MLA more than 4 lines, or APA 40 words or longer, They both actually have the exact same formatting, which is kind of nice. So prior to giving the citation, the quote rather, you should you should give information for where this is coming from. So you can see we have as stated by in-text citation information. So depending on MLA or APA, that's going to look different, but typically that's going to be the author information, perhaps the date. Then you give the quote, and that quote is indented. The entire thing is indented in 1/2 inch to indicate that it's all part of the same quote and to visually distinguish it from the paragraph that it is contained within. And then at the end of the quote, you have a period and then the rest of your in-text citation information. Typically, that's going to be the location, such as a page number. After that, you hit enter and then you backspace typically to continue on with your paragraph after you finish with that long quote, because you need to always follow up on a quote that you're including to explain why you've included it. So that should be fully flush with the left margin so it looks like it's continuing the paragraph after the indented portion. So the nice thing about long quotes is that they are formatted to look exactly the same for both MLA and APA. Another thing to talk about, which is generally shared between MLA and APA, are the difference between big titles and small titles. We also call these containers, things that contain smaller things, and things that are contained, smaller works that are part of something larger. So larger works that contain smaller pieces are usually placed in italics. So that can include book titles, music albums, journals, websites, TV shows, anything that has a smaller portion to it. Those smaller pieces then that are contained in those larger works are generally placed in quotation marks. So that would be a chapter in a book, or a song on an album, or an article in a journal, etc., etc. So for some examples here, you can see the book versus the chapter, the album versus the song, etc. down the way. And these are all good examples of that title case guidelines that I mentioned earlier. Not all words are capitalized. The first word is always capitalized, and then any quote-unquote important words, smaller words like articles, prepositions, and conjunctions generally are not capitalized in these types of titles. Now I will note that when we're talking about this, this is always the case for MLA, no matter where it's placed in your paper, whether it's in the text or if it's in the works cited list. But in APA style, these rules only apply when you're using the titles of things in the text of your paper. There are different rules for the references list that we're going to be talking about when you're talking about the quotation marks and italics and the capitalization rules. So these are just general guidelines, but you do want to think about when you're including these titles in your paper and whether these rules apply, particularly in APA style. So the third category of difference to talk about are in-text citations. This is when you are giving credit for a source when you've used information from it in your paper. MLA and APA have similarities between these, but what they look like and how you use them are a bit different. So in MLA, you always include the first element of the full citation from the works cited list. This is typically going to be the author's last name. And then you include the location information. That's the hashtag here. That's typically going to be the page number for where that material appears in the source, but not always. Sometimes that's a paragraph number, sometimes it's a timestamp. It just kind of depends on the type of source you're working with. You'll notice that in the parentheses, it's first element, space, location, close parentheses. There's no punctuation or anything else in there. And you can see the example at the bottom, Collins 23, as that sort of filled out as an example. That is also able to be done in breaking the information up so that part of it is in the sentence as context. So you can see we have according to whatever the first element is, and then at the end, after you've given information from the source, you place that location on its own in parentheses. It's going to be similar in APA, as I said. The major difference is you have some punctuation in there, as well as always using the year of publication alongside the first element of the source. So if the first element is the author's last name, you always have first element in the full information in the parentheses, first element, comma, year, comma, again, location information. So that would be, for example, at the bottom, in parentheses, Collins, comma, 2019, comma, P period 23. So whatever that first element is, and they're going to be different depending on the number of authors, or if the author is actually an organization, the rules are always different. But whatever that first element is, you follow it with a comma, the year, and only the year. If it has a month and a day attached to it, you can omit that for the in-text citation, comma, and then location information. Now, the location information is typically, again, going to be a page number. If you have a page number, you put P period, whatever the number is. If it's, say, a paragraph number, you would do PARA period with the number. You do that in MLA as well. Otherwise, for timestamps or other types of things, you can look up how to do those differently. But because page number is the most common, we've given that as an example here. The last thing I will mention is the other way of including this information is to break it up, to place some of the information in the sentence as context. And in APA style, whenever you pull information out of the parentheses as context, you always place the year where you place the first element. So the year always goes along with it. So here you would have, for example, according to Collins, parentheses, 2019, close parentheses, comma, giving the information from the source, whatever it is, and then in parentheses again you would have P period 23. So here's where we give a little bit more information about the number of authors and how those look. Generally speaking, if you have one or two authors on a source, you're going to cite those names every single time. They just look a little bit different depending on if you're citing an MLA or if you're citing an APA. So in MLA, one author, you have the name in the text. You can say Collins notes and give information, and then at the end in parentheses give the page number. Or you can provide everything at the end. So the saying goes, whatever the information is, close or parentheses, Collins space 23, close parentheses, period. If you have two authors, you have just their last names with an and in between them every single time. So Diamond and Young state, whatever the information, parentheses with the page number, or whatever the information is, and then everything in the parentheses, parentheses, Diamond and Young, space, 135, close parentheses, period. In APA, one author, it's the same every time, Collins, parentheses, year, because again, you always place the year where you put the first element in APA, and then again, the page number at the end, or everything at the end, the saying goes, quote, so same as over here. But here we've inserted the year with commas between the parts with a P period to designate page number here. The main difference, and the thing I like to highlight, is that with two authors, you have it a little bit different depending on if the names are in the sentence or if the names are in the parentheses at the end. In the sentence, if you're using the author's names as context, you use the word and. So Diamond and Young, 2022 state. Or if you're putting everything in the parentheses at the end, you use the symbol ampersand. So thus, quote, parentheses, Diamond, ampersand, Young, comma, 2022, comma, page 135. The way that I remember this is you place the word with the words, so and in the sentence, and the symbol with the symbols, the ampersand, inside the parentheses. That's really the only major difference in ways that it's formatted for one or two authors in both citation styles. If you have a source that has three or more authors, in the sentence, you format those exactly the same, no matter whether it's MLA or APA. You always list the first author's name, and then you can substitute the phrase et al, et space al period, for all the rest of the names. So you can see here, Kang et al, found, yada yada, and then the page number at the end in parentheses, or putting everything in parentheses, in other words, comma, quote, and then Kang et al 36 in parentheses. Notice there's no other punctuation besides the period after the AL. In APA, you again list the first author's name and then et al. If you're putting it in the sentence, just remember you're putting the year as well wherever you place the author information. So Kang et al, parentheses, 2016, and parentheses. Or if you're putting everything at the end, in other words, quote, parentheses, Kang et al, period, comma, space, 2016, comma, space, P period, space 36. So that's how that should go. So one or two authors every time, but in APA, two authors are handled a little bit differently depending on how you integrate it. And three or more authors it uses at all after the first author's name, the primary difference being the integration of the year in APA for all of these. So when we talk about the last category, the end citation, this is where we see some of the most primary differences between the styles. There are still some similarities though. In both MLA and APA, you only cite the sources that you actually use in your paper. It's the works cited in your paper. It's the references in your paper. So make sure that you're not including anything that you don't actually end up using. All citations get what's called a hanging indent. That's where the first line of a citation is all the way over to the left. And then if it goes on to a second or a third line, those subsequent lines are indented over 1/2 inch. You always list what citations you have in alphabetical order by whatever comes first in each of those. So you can see Bernstein Barton comes before Bernstein Mark, which comes before Bouquet, and then Bradway, and all the way down. You do generally start on a new page following the end of your paper. You can use page breaks to do this, but the label for each page should be at the top of the next page following the end of your paper. Some instructors don't care, or they even tell you, please just start it right immediately after the end of your paper to save paper, but the actual rules of MLA and APA call for the start of a new page. And then also both styles call for consistent font spacing, size, and type with the rest of your paper. So if you use Times New Roman in the body of your paper, you should use Times New Roman here. If you use Calibri size 11 in the body of your paper, you should use it here. Whichever you use, it should be the same. So these are examples and what it should generally look like, and you can see at the top of the page, center aligned with no other special formatting, you have the label Works Cited for MLA. In APA, you can see at the top of the page, center aligned and bolded, you have the title References. Now, fun little fact, if you have one source and one source only for your paper, you shorten the title of that page to be singular. So instead of Works Cited, it's just Work Cited. Instead of References, it's just Reference. So that's just something to keep in mind. Not a lot of papers are only going to have one source, but in case you have one of those, you do shorten the title of the page. Now, as far as what goes into these citations, they both have their own sort of formula for what you include, so I'll cover that briefly. In MLA 9th style, as I said earlier, it is context driven, meaning that they have one formula for any citation, and it's up to you to figure out what's going to fit into each of these parts and then fill it in appropriately. That includes, generally, you're always going to have an author and then a title of the source, though not always. And then you go into container information. So container is a bunch of information related to where this title of the source written by these authors can be found in the world. So that can include the title of the container, any contributors and what roles they played, version number and issue number, the publisher information, the date, and then the location if relevant, which can include place of publication, but that can also include things like a URL or a DOI number. MLA also includes other optional supplemental elements, which can include a date of original publication if it's relevant, that this is a reprint or something like that. The city of publication if it's unique for the version you're looking at, any other facts that are relevant. And then lastly, a date of access. If you're looking at something that might change, it'd be good to know when you looked at it in case someone else ends up looking at it later and it's different from how you looked at it. Sometimes in MLA you'll also run into cases where you have a secondary container. So for example, you have a journal article, so the article title is here, and then all of this would be the journal and the issue and version numbers and the DOI number and such like that. But you found that journal article in a database. And so you also want to include the database name and the DOI number secondarily to the main container. So you can just sort of rinse and repeat for as many containers as you need to for an MLA citation. So let's look at an example. This is a one of those exact things I just talked about. This is a scholarly journal article that was found in an online database. And so here you can see the author information first, followed by the title information. Then we have the container information for the first container, which is the journal. So you can see we have the name of the first container, the version for that first container, the date, and then the location of the title, the source you're looking at in that first container. So that includes the page range in this case. But because we also found it in a database, we would list that as a secondary container. And in this case, we don't really have the rest of this version and date and stuff. We would just include the name of the container and then the location, which is the DOI number. Now in APA, there are 4 different categories of information you include in an end citation. That includes the author information. The author can be a person or a list of persons, so actual people, or an organization or a business. So you might have, Jane Smith and John Doe contributed an article to a certain journal, so you'd list them, or it's a report from the ACLU or something like that. The date would include the date published or posted. So not just the date for the entire website that you can find at the bottom of the page by the copyright symbol. We're talking about the date that your source specifically was posted or last updated in particular. The title is what you're actually citing from, and if you're citing from something that is particularly unique, you might need to use brackets at the end of the title to describe it. So for example, for a video or a podcast episode, you would, in quotation marks, give the name of that video or audio file, and before that period at the end of that title, you would in brackets say like podcast episode or YouTube video or something like that. And then lastly, we have the source. This is similar to the container publisher information on the MLA side. So this includes the title of the container and then where that container lives or where in the container this source lives. So location information. So let's look at that same citation and see how it's different in APA citation style. So here you can see we have author information at the top. Date gets front-loaded to the top end of the citation because, again, currency matters very much in APA style. The title here, which if you notice it has different capitalization than in the MLA, which we're going to talk about in a second. And then the rest of this all encompasses location information. So you can notice that it's all pretty much similar, but it's all lumped into location. And we don't list the database name here because APA does not ask for database names. They don't care about the secondary container stuff unless it's a very specific circumstance, and in this case it really wasn't meeting the requirements for that. So let's look at them together. You can see some differences. In MLA, you have author information formatted a little different. For 2 authors, you have last name, comma, first name, comma, the word and, then first name, last name. In APA, you always change first and middle names to initials, again for the diminishing bias purposes I talked about earlier. So here you can see we have Puick, comma, L period, comma, and then an ampersand before the last author's name, but again it is last name, comma, initial. So authors are formatted a little bit differently. The date, like I said, was front-loaded in the APA citation, whereas in MLA we just jump right into the title. And then speaking of the title, you can see in MLA we have double quotes around the entire title, and it is in title case. So those capitalization rules are followed here, same as I described earlier. Versus in APA, you only have the single quotes around this sort of phrase. You wouldn't otherwise have quotation marks in an APA reference list citation for the title. And then again, the capitalization rules are a little bit different. You only capitalize the first word of the title, the first word of the subtitle, and then if there's any proper nouns in the citation, you also capitalize those. But everything else in an APA title is lowercased. Next we have the container, so we have the container title, the version number, the date here, and the location. And in APA, the container title is the same. The journal is formatted the exact same in italics, and it is capitalized here. That's not always the case for container titles, but for a journal article it is. The volume number doesn't get a sort of label, it's just the number, but if you can tell, it's kind of hard to see here, it is in italics as well. If you have a source with an issue number, you would place that in parentheses immediately after the volume number, and it would not be in italics. So it would be 54 in italics, not in italics, parentheses, 3 or whatever number, close parentheses. But in this case, we just have the volume number, so we have that. And then you'll notice in MLA we have PP period before the page range, and we did abbreviate the page range. So we cut out the 3 because we understand, therefore it's pages 358 to 367. Whereas in APA, you don't have a label, there's no PP period, and you put the full numbers for the range here. And then in the MLA citation, we also have container 2, so Science Direct is the database we found this article in, and then comma the DOI number in URL format here. In APA, you have a period at the end of the page range, and then you just put the URL in the DOI number in URL format immediately after it. You don't need the name of the database, as I said before. This is a very specific type of source, probably one you're going to run into in your time as a student, but these rules apply to pretty much any citation you'll run into, whether it's a website article or page or a book chapter or even a video or something like that. These sort of rules do apply, you just do them a little bit different for the different types of sources. If you have more questions or need more information about different types of sources, I welcome you to check out our workshops specific to APA and MLA rather than versus each other. In this workshop, those run each semester, and you're also able to request them one-on-one with one of our tutors. But also we have written materials on our website that I encourage you to check out as well that give even more examples of these different types of sources. So some things to remember about end citations that I think are important, specifically about author names. When you have 2 author names, I already said this, you have last name, comma, first name for the first author, but then comma and first name, last name for the second author. If you have 3 or more author names in an MLA citation in the works cited list, you have the first author's name, last name, comma, first name, and then you have comma, that same et al. Construction we used in text to just substitute for all the rest of the author's names. In APA, you always list last name, comma, initials, the first and middle names regardless of how they're acknowledged by the source, and you list them all out. If you have 20 or more authors, you do it a little bit differently, but because that's not common at all, I won't necessarily cover that here. I'll just say that no matter how many author names you have, you always format them last name, comma, initial, period, comma, and then before the last author's name, you include an ampersand. So here we have Diamond and Young formatted, but you would insert all the other authors' names before that ampersand if you had 3 or more. Another thing with titles of sources, in MLA you always place them in quotes or italics depending on if they're a short work or a container, and you always place them in title case. So you can see here title of an article, The Fundamentals of Mental Health Advocacy at Colleges and Universities, a systematic review, in quotation marks and in title case. In APA, you never use quotation marks in the end references. You always use italics though. The source title has particular capitalization rules as well that I covered, where you only capitalize the first word of the title, the first word of a subtitle, and any proper nouns. In this case, this title does not have proper nouns, so we've only capitalized the and a following the colon, and otherwise it looks just like this in the reference list. Now, generally the rules for italics for containers is true, but if you have, for example, a website source, so it's not part of a periodical like a journal or a magazine or newspaper, it's just living on a website somewhere, the rules get a little fuzzier in APA, and again, I would point you to our specific resources on APA format and rules for that, but just know that the container title may get italics, it might not, and it may get normal capitalization, it might not. So if you want more specifics on those rules, please feel free to reach out. There's some other stuff just worth noting. In MLA, you do place commas between container elements and periods between major elements. So the author information ends with period. The title information ends with period. All of the container information is together and separated by commas. So you would have, say, the journal title, comma, volume number, comma, page range, period is the end of that section. You do not need to list both the site, the publisher title or the site name if they're the same. So in this case, we have the New York Times website. We got an article off of there. And then if you get to the bottom of the page where the copyright symbol is, you can see the publisher name is the New York Times Company. Well, that's very similar. So you do not need to list both of those. You only need to list the actual site name in italics. And then you only list an access date. It's a supplemental optional element if the source is not permanently linked or published. So if it's, say, a page on the CDC's website for ADHD or something, that information might be updated over time as the science shifts and changes. And so if you are working with something that doesn't have an actual publication date and it's just sort of living on the internet, you might need to include that access date. Some other information for APA style, you do italicize volume numbers and you do not italicize issue numbers if you have a source that does come with issue numbers. You only need to add retrieval date if the source is not permanently linked or published, in which case prior to the URL you would put retrieved with the month, day, year. So retrieved October 9, 2023 from, and then you have the URL. But you only do that if the source is, again, something that is not officially published and it is something that might be updated over time. And then generally you don't have a need to include secondary containers like database names like you do in MLA unless the source is only found through that database. There are some databases that are sort of closed. ERIC, E-R-I-C, is an education database and it includes a lot of proprietary articles that you can't find in other places. So if that's the case, then it is good to list it in an APA citation, but otherwise if it can be found in multiple places, then you don't need to indicate which database you used to locate it. So this concludes our workshop on the differences between MLA and APA style. Again, I will point you to our website where you can find lots of great resources on the different citation styles more individually, more specifically. And if you have specific questions or you'd like help from a tutor in navigating these things, please feel free to reach out for an appointment. We can meet in person or over Zoom, or we can even offer feedback over email for your writing coursework. So if you'd like someone to help you make sure you're mastering your APA or your MLA style, we are a great place to go for help. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a good time with writing an MLA or APA style.